Well, guess what happens? If you just flip this around, imagine somebody was doing that with the Bible,
Right.
right? Well, it's not hard to imagine because people do it all the
They
time,
do it
right?
all the time. Welcome to our channel, where we make it our ambition to respect and learn from our neighbors, to equip the church, and share the message of Jesus until all hear. So if you have been working your way through our introductory series of videos to our channel, we've talked a lot about different ways and philosophies behind engagement, but now it's time to get down to the practical things. And we came up with a list of do's and don'ts for you all to put to use for your interfaith dialogues.
Yeah, so before we really get into the specific do's and don'ts, we think it's important to distinguish between texts and sources, we could call it on one hand, and people, engaging people on another hand. Because when we're thinking about engaging people of different religions, and it could be, for those watching, could be for you you could be a Christian, and you're thinking about how do I engage others because I'm interested to share the truth of the gospel with them in evangelism. Or it could be you're watching as a non-Christian and you might be just interested our perspective as Christians on it. And in a way, the principles we want to lay out are broad, or we believe really in a sense are universal in terms of could be searching and exploring, studying another religion and engaging other people with an interest more to explore whether that's true. Or it could be from the angle of I'm trying to share about my faith with them and in hopes that I can persuade them because I believe that I have the truth that they need to know. So as we do that, it's important to make the distinction between texts and sources on the one hand and people on the other, because, I think probably we all get this point that when we're talking to other people from other religions or faiths, they don't necessarily know everything about their religion or the theology, or let's say they have an accurate understanding of all the doctrine or the theology or philosophy or the scriptures and the texts. And a religion is really not defined by the individual person who's a proponent of that religion.
Right.
Just like if somebody comes to us, wants to learn about Christianity, or just they go to any Christian and they ask, what does Christianity teach? We hope that they're not going to think that just because the answer they got was from a Christian, that answer is necessarily accurate, right?
We're not the authority.
Right. And, even if I was a Catholic and I had a institution that was an authority that defines what is to be interpreted in the text, we hope if they're talking to an individual Catholic, they're not going to assume that is necessarily what the Catechism teaches and the Catholic Church, etc. So religion and people who are proponents of that religion, they don't always line up. So we have to draw a distinction between them. And for us also, if we're trying to understand accurately what the other religion teaches, or if we're trying to understand whether it's true, we want to ultimately go to the authority. And the authority in most religions is going to be some text or religion or document or institution. So the individual proponent isn't the one that is the ultimate one defining it. So when we talk with people, we don't assume that they're always accurately representing it, but we want to talk to people because that's ultimately our interest. We want to build relationships and we want to strive together for the truth, and we want to share the truth, we want to understand. So it's a limited amount you can do in reading books, but that is also important to know what formally is taught.
Yes. So we have do's and don'ts before engagement and also do's and don'ts while engaging. Mm-hmm. Do your homework. Study with a sincere desire to learn. What's most important about before engaging is that you get a basic grasp of the major tenets of that religion. The best way to approach the study of another religion is to take the perspective of the believer. So when you are reading their text, when you're reading online about what the religion teaches, try to think about it through the lens of someone who believes that religion to be true. This will give you a much stronger understanding of where they're coming from, and understanding of where they are coming from in conversation is vital for it to be fruitful and for you to build strong rapport with them when you actually are engaging.
Don't only get information from those who don't believe. So for this point, this is really crucial. So I especially as Christians, we really want to emphasize for our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, if you're trying to share the gospel to other people of other different religious backgrounds, if you want to understand the other side, don't just read from Christians and what they say about it. So if I'm going to read a book on Buddhism, if I want to understand Buddhism, the best way to do is read a book on Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy by a Buddhist, rather than read about how to share the gospel with a Buddhist by a Christian, right? Or a critique of Buddhist philosophy from a Christian perspective. Well, we're not saying don't read any of those books or that you should never read them, but don't primarily or don't only get your information from Christians. Often there is misunderstandings by Christians about other religions, or it could be from atheists representing Christianity or Muslims representing Christianity. It can go in every direction, right? So the principle applies to everybody, not just for Christians. How would I know ultimately what the other side believes other than reading from them? Yeah, so for this point also, I want to make another kind of addendum to it, which is don't go on a fault-finding mission. This is I really hope that you remember this point, because I find this is really crucial. Whenever we're reading somebody else's texts or sources that are primary sources from the other side, or it could even be a secondary source that's an article about what the others, that let's say it's Islam, what they believe, or about Mormonism, whatever it is. When we're reading those things, or we're reading their scriptures, the Quran or the Upanishads, don't just look to find the things that are wrong with it. That's finding faults. So you're searching for all the things that are wrong that you can exploit and use against them to corner them and show that it's wrong. Well, guess what happens? If you just flip this around, imagine somebody was doing that with the Bible. Right? Well, it's not hard to imagine because people do it all the time, right?
All the time.
So you can search for all the things that are wrong with the Quran or the Bible or whatever, the Vedas, and then use that against them. Well, are you really actually accurately understanding them? Have you read them in context? Do you know how the other side interprets them? Because if you don't know that, how do you know that you're actually having a solid critique?
Right.
Like, it's not that we shouldn't ever critique. We need to do that ultimately, but
Right.
to have a better critique, to know that it's a solid one, a sound one, is we need to properly understand the text on their own terms and not just search for errors. So we want to search for understanding and accuracy, not faults.
Just a final summary in terms of the rules that we encourage you to follow before you actually engage with those of different faiths is to study their faith and what they believe, how you would want a non-believer to study Christianity before they approached you with critical questions or with their issues with it.
Right. Do test your arguments. So for this point, what we're essentially saying is we've made some points about do's and don'ts about studying the other side, so more focused on texts and sources. When we're engaging with people of other religious backgrounds, essentially we want to take that book learning and the stuff we've studied, maybe we've developed some arguments or points we want to make. Essentially what we want to do is we want to test our arguments and test our understanding. Because you can only do that so much with books. You will find actually when you're communicating with people that really believe it, they have generally more of a bigger grasp on the context of how those things are understood within their religious community. that's actually one of the main things that we're missing. I might miss things because I don't hear about it preached about. I don't hear about it discussed or applied within the religious community because I'm not part of that religious community.
Right.
Another aspect of it is that if my aim is also coming at it from the point of view of an evangelist and I'm trying to reach them, ultimately I'm trying to persuade them.
Right.
Right. Now, actually, some Christians don't like this talk about persuading.
Right.
I think this is very silly that Christians don't actually aim at persuading. I can never force somebody to change their mind simply by giving an argument. But the aim of the art of persuasion, of rhetoric, is you're trying to bring them to a place to be convinced by the evidence and the reasoning. You can't make them, it's up to them, but you lay out the best case you can. So if I'm going to seek to persuade them, then I want to test my understanding of the things that I've been studying, and I do that in conversation.
Do be open to correction. Being open to correction is tied in with the point that Greg just made about testing your arguments, is that you've done your study, you've done your best to grasp the basics. Now you're engaging with someone who is immersed in this culture. There are going to be misunderstandings on your part. Like, let's not pretend we don't have biases when approaching information, especially when we are approaching it as an evangelist. We are going to have to be open to being corrected on our understanding. And this is an important posture to take in conversations, is to take the posture as, in the conversation, approach it as wanting to learn more. When you approach it in this way, when you approach it as, I have an opportunity now to validate what I've studied and learn whether or not I have a good grasp of what they believe, it's very, very difficult to offend them. It's very difficult for a wall to come up between you and them when you take this position.
Right.
You will gain their respect, you will build rapport, and you will also you'll sort of catalog lots of ideas for future conversations, because ultimately that's what we want. We want continued dialogue, we want more conversations, and we want more questions asked. And this is just going to build a strong relationship with the people from different faiths, and they will also start to gain a better perspective overall. If you're a Christian like we are, they'll start to have a different perspective on Christians. Where before, where they're used to people coming at them with this sort of trying to corner them, coming at it like all they've done is gone on fault-finding missions, they haven't done their homework properly. They come into the conversation with this sort of posture that they're ready to dismantle your faith on the spot.
Right.
This is going to close doors, not open them. This is going to burn bridges, not build them.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add one more thing that goes with this idea of being open to correction. From one vantage point, this video is about sharing the gospel as a Christian, sharing our faith with others and trying to help others to see what we believe is the truth. But also, more broadly speaking, I think these principles are universal. So if somebody is searching to try to understand the truth, or maybe even the Christian is doubting, the point is we want to test what we believe, and we want to test what other people believe. And if we come at it with the assumption that basically there's no possible way I am wrong, right? That I can't be corrected. Well, one, it's arrogant, right? It is arrogant, because who are you to think that there's no possible way that you could be wrong about something? There's a principle that people talk about called falsification. And this is the idea that, is there a possible way, hypothetically, to show that the Bible is false? Right? It's not to say that, okay, so let's just take for granted that, okay, let's say the Bible is true. It doesn't mean that hypothetically you couldn't show that it's false. For example, Paul says if Jesus wasn't resurrected from the dead, then what he's talking about, the apostles are testifying to, that he was raised from the dead, is false. Christianity is false, and we're above all to be pitied. 1 Corinthians 15. The Bible is full of these kinds of things because the Bible is historical in nature. It's making historical claims. So if you can falsify those historical claims, you can show that those things actually didn't happen, then you would show that the Bible is false. Now, I don't think that ultimately someone will be able to show that, because I believe the Bible is true. I believe it will stand up to scrutiny, so I can actually test it out. But I need to at least hypothetically be open to correction and say, yes, it's possible that I could be wrong. And if you could show me that, look, because what we should care about is following the truth.
Right.
Right? So this is the posture we should all be taking. And on the higher level of our own worldview and religion, is it true or false? Or even in the arguments. Don't assume the worst. So for this point, actually, I was inspired by this, by a rabbinical teaching in the Mishnah, in part of the Mishnah called Pirkei Avot, which is often translated the wisdom of the fathers. There's a saying, and I cannot get the exact saying, but I'll just summarize the point, that I've been inspired by this for many years. And basically, one of the rabbis says in the Mishnah that you should essentially assume the best about the other person, or assume what is honorable about the other person, unless or until proven otherwise. The point about this is, if I assume the best or assume what is honorable and good about the other person, and if I'm shown that actually I was incorrect, that actually that person did something bad or said something bad, but I'm assuming that they didn't, I'm assuming that they've been honorable, then when I'm shown wrong, there's no fault on my part, because I've assumed the best about them, right? In fact, I've gone above and beyond. I've been showing them charity and grace. And if you flip it, if I do the opposite, if I assume the worst or what is dishonorable about the other person, and then I'm proven wrong, the rabbis are basically pointing out, then you're actually in sin. Right. You actually did something unethical by assuming something bad about the other person, when in fact it was wrong. You're essentially accepting something slanderous. So this is the principle that I glean from a lot, I think about.
It's a great principle.
And applying this in conversations, and you can also apply it in the text as well, but in conversation when you're talking with people, don't assume the worst about them. Don't assume that they're lying. Don't assume that they're trying to deceive you. Don't assume the worst about the people, okay, that you're talking with. And don't assume the worst about their interpretation. A great example of this that Christians do all the time that's wrong, that I like to point out a lot of times when talking with Muslims, Allah is the greatest deceiver. Okay, so Christians often make this point, and they look at some verses from the Quran, and basically they say, look, it says he's the greatest of deceivers. Well, and if you because let's go back to the point about testing your arguments. If you actually talk with Muslims, you can test that argument, and I have not found one Muslim who hasn't made the point of correcting this by saying that's not really what the Arabic means. None of the Muslims understand it this way. So what does that verse mean? Essentially, sometimes they will say the word essentially means to plan or plot, right? Some translate, I think, as scheme. The point here, this is, even though it sounds negative, the context is negative that Allah is responding to in the Quran, because basically he's responding to people who are scheming and plotting against his people and against the plans that Allah has. So then he's saying, like, look, they're stupid, they're foolish for trying to plot against God. Who are we to scheme, try to achieve some successful scheme and outplan and outsmart God? That would be utterly foolish. And so the point is, God is a better planner, a better plotter, a better schemer relative to the schemers, right? See, in other words, he's a better strategist. Of course he is. He's God, right? So that's just a great example, I find, where people assume the worst interpretation about a text, and then they try to turn it around to exploit it. And our point is, don't assume the worst. Because in the end, what you're doing is you're misrepresenting the other side. And to go back to one of the points Daniel was making, you're actually, in the flip side, you're not building respect. You're actually showing them that you're on a fault-finding mission, and they're gonna lose respect for you.
I mean, it made me immediately think of Psalm 1, which is essentially making the same point. that the nations they come together and they plot against the Lord and his anointed.
Right.
But he sits in the heavens and he laughs.
Yeah, it's Psalm 2, but yeah.
Psalm 2,
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. No, but yes.
It's
But
essentially the
actually,
same point.
well, actually, there's even passages in the Bible that are much stronger than that, right? But we'll probably do a full video on
Right,
that
not to
argument
derail the
and
video.
not to derail it, but yeah.
Don't straw man, but steel man. Now, straw man is the logical fallacy of misrepresenting your, I don't know if I can call them your opponent, but whoever you're debating with, whoever you're discussing with. Straw manning is when you misrepresent what they believe and you attack that. I mean, this goes so much with the points that we've already mentioned in this video, but steel manning, this is the important point. We want to build the strongest case possible for the other side and then go after that. So if there is to be a strong attack or a strong persuasion against someone that is in a different faith than you want to represent their side's strongest arguments and then attack those.
Right. Don't discount spiritual experiences. There's a few things I'd like to say about this point. One is that a lot of the do's and don'ts we've been talking about so far have been mainly like intellectual. Right. So from this point of view, we want to acknowledge that the experiences people have in their life should not be discounted. I don't want to make decisions simply based on my experiences, right? Especially when it comes to my ultimate belief system and my view of reality. However, our experiences are part of what shape our perspective about reality. We can't ignore them. If I'm trying to get at understanding the way things really are, ultimate reality, we're essentially trying to look at all the data and try to provide the best explanation for the most amount of data. And that data is going to include your experiences. Sometimes people make a false dichotomy between factual things and the intellectual stuff versus subjective experiences. In a way, an experience could be subjective, like it's the subject, it's the individual that has the experience. But something happened. There is a reality to what happened. Ultimately, what we're saying is don't discount the experience. You need to come to grips with it, you need to grapple with it, and you need to take account of it. And your account of it might be that something was wrong with your sensory perception, okay? It could be, if I had a dream, the dream could be explained by God communicating something. It could be explained by something bad I ate. It could be explained by my subconscious. The point is there's a lot of range of sources for that experience that I just had, possible influences that we want to be open to consider and weigh out what is the best explanation given my experience and given everything else. For Christians, I think we might have a tendency to say, oh, well, that person is telling me about some spiritual or religious experience that doesn't seem to align with the Bible. Maybe we question whether that really happened. Maybe they're lying. And I want to say, going back to some of the other points, is we want to generally not assume the worst, but assume the best. So if we're going to assume the best about their character and we're going to assume that they're not lying until proven otherwise, it's not just that we always assume it and never allow that they could be lying. Of course, we don't want to lack discernment. But if we assume that they're not lying and we want to consider what they're saying as this really happened, well, then we also have to consider different possible explanations. And from a Christian perspective, we also are supernaturalists, so we believe that there's more than just the natural realm and the material realm. But I would say look at it from other religious angles too. For example, like, I've known of personally and heard about many Muslims who've had dreams, let's say about Jesus or the Trinity or other things, right? That have kind of been part of what has guided them in their spiritual journey, leading them. Some of them might ultimately come to faith in Jesus and become a Christian, right? So I know about those kinds of things. So a Muslim who's going to hear about dreams that Christians have had, like, how are they going to explain it? Well, they're probably going to think that it's from shaitan, it's from Satan, or maybe, I don't know, from a jinn. In other words, it's from a bad source. Just like a Christian might think a New Ager has a dream about Jesus, but the dream they have it about Jesus, even though it's like all light and peace, that Jesus says you should, the Bible isn't true, or I don't know, like it gives some message that contradicts Christian teaching, the biblical teaching. So we're going to immediately think, oh, well, it must be from a demon. Well, okay, so that could be the case. But the point is, we don't want to say, well, the person didn't have the experience. We want to acknowledge the fact that that experience could be the case. Because what if they did have that experience and they're not lying, and you're just going to say that you didn't have the experience? What are they going to think? Like, what, you can't handle the fact that the Bible can't handle that? I guess the Bible's not true, right? I think of, from my own background, growing up in a home with a New Age parent, I heard about past life memories people have. Like, obviously I don't believe in past lives, right? I don't believe in reincarnation. But some people will look to, people say they claim that they have memories of a previous life, and they'll elaborate on it and give all this detail, and actually then they go and check it, and it actually matches. And how do you explain all that, right? So if we just respond by saying, well, that didn't happen, well, it's possible that somebody might be lying, but it's also possible they're not lying and they had a real experience and they do have that information. My question might be, okay, well, let's assume that that was a real experience. You had that information of, you used to live at that house, you knew where something was in that house. I'm thinking of an example I've read about. Somebody went to the home that they supposedly lived in their past life, and they went up in the attic and they went under the floorboards and were looking for something, and right, that used to be there, and the person corroborated, yeah, that thing used to be there, we just moved it, right? Just like elaborate details, like how would this person know it? There's no way this person could have like faked it. So how do you account for something like that? Well, I would say, well, it's information, it comes from a mind. So either it's a memory, or someone else who knew about that information communicated that information to this person, and that person, maybe they even genuinely think that this was their own thought, but may have actually come from an external source, right? In other words, a spirit. So my point is, we need to look at all the different possible explanations and not just immediately assume the worst and not assume that it didn't happen.
Yeah, I was going to say that ties in perfectly with your earlier point about don't assume the worst. We need to assume the best about their character and their interpretation. And thinking about not discounting experiences, I've personally experienced things before I was a Christian that at the time I would explain in a very different way. All I know is that it was a very real experience. And I think that perhaps something useful in conversation where someone is sharing an experience, don't feel we need to dissect it and try to tear it apart right on the spot.
Or like just give an answer right then.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. We can let it be. We need to assume it was a real experience, and that though there are many plausible explanations, sometimes the best strategy is to leave it be and just, maybe it'll come up another time when you can talk more about it. I think a personal example is I know someone that is genuinely convinced that they were transported. They were
like teleported.
Yeah, like teleported.
Yeah.
And they base it based on, is it Philip in Acts? I think it's Philip, after he baptizes the Ethiopian eunuch. But this is like, I don't know what to do with this experience. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a number of possible explanations, but I really don't know what to do with it. And so for the most part, I just let it be, and I need to assume the best in what they're explaining to me, and that they genuinely had an experience that this is the appearance.
Right.
So these are our bare bones rules of engagement, so to speak, with interfaith dialogue. I think that there's a lot more that could be added to this. There's a lot more that we could expand on. Give us a thumbs up if you like the rules of engagement, if you feel that these are universally, they can be universally accepted. And also, if you wanted to personally add something, leave it in the comments below. We'd like to read it, and we'll also respond to you. Please share this video if you found this helpful, and remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you want to see more like it. Until next time, keep learning, keep loving, and keep sharing until all here.